Welcome, good people. My name is Joel Collier, and today we're going to talk about multi-categorical variables and how those are analyzed in AMOS, the structural equation modeling software program. So before we kind of jump into an example of AMOS, I want to kind of talk real briefly about how multi-categorical variables are kind of dummy coded before they actually get into the analysis part into AMOS, because that's where multi-categorical variables gets a little tricky in just kind of understanding how I'm going to kind of code these different categories before I kind of take it to AMOS. So let's take a look at an example here. It's a very simple model, which was came from a restaurant setting. We were surveying customers, and they asked them, "Hey, did the server adapt their behavior to you during the experience?" So did that adaptive behavior ultimately lead to what we call customer delight? Were you really delighted from your experience? And then from that delight, were you more inclined to spread kind of positive word of mouth about your experience to others? So kind of simple model. So if we had it just as a categorical variable as that adaptive behavior at the very beginning, that independent variable, and it was just simply dichotomous, it may just be, well, did they adapt the behavior or did they not adapt the behavior? So we had two kind of categories. Well, what we'd do is we'd go into SPSS, we'd form a new variable, and we would dummy code those. So all of those um, customers who had their service experience kind of adapted to them, well, they'd be coded as a 1. All the ones that didn't have their experience kind of adapted to them, they'd be coded as a 0. And so we would use this kind of new, kind of dummy coded variable as kind of that adaptive behavior construct at the front, and we would kind of run our analysis. The problem though is well, what happens if there's more than two categories then? Because I don't have kind of a 1-0 anymore, and you're not going to dummy code it into a 2-1-0 because that's just problematic. So let's say we had 3 categories instead of 2 with that adaptive behavior. So a category 1 was, let's say, that the server adapted the experience, but just at the very beginning. So we want to see, does it matter when you adapt even the experience? Not even just presence or absence, but maybe just when it even takes place. So category 1 would be they adapted the experience at the beginning. Category 2 would be maybe they adapted the service, but not till the very end. And then category 3 is they didn't adapt the service at all. So we've got 3 categories in the front, kind of our independent variable. So one that you have to do to dummy code this is you have to create multiple kind of dichotomous constructs to represent all of these different ones across the 3 categories. So for instance, if we're dummy coding the first category, which is they adapted the service at the very beginning. So we'd create kind of a new construct. We'd call it, I'm just calling it adapt begin. And how I would dummy code that is I would, all those that got their experience adapted at the beginning, I'm going to code that as a 1. Those adapted at the end, they're a 0. And those that didn't adapt, they're a 0 as well. And then I'm going to need to create another variable, and we'll call this one adapt at the end. And so in that, all those adapted to the beginning in that particular variable are going to be coded as a 0. Those are adapted at the end as a 1, and then did not adapt is a 0 as well. Now you notice I did not have a third construct that was did not adapt, where it would be like the adapt at beginning 0, adapted at end 0, did not adapt 1. Like I didn't include that one. And the reason why is because you need what's called kind of a reference variable. So one of your categories, in instance of these 3, is going to be used as a reference. And as a reference, it will be coded as a 0 in every category across those dummy codings. And so in this instance, we're going to have the they did not adapt the service as kind of the reference category. You can make the reference category anything you want. Typically what happens is if you have kind of a control, or if you're manipulating something and you have a control variable, the control variable is typically considered the reference in that. And so with our three categories, instead of having just a single independent construct called adaptive behavior now going to customer delight, now we have two new constructs on the front end. One's called adapt begin, where again we dummy coded the adapt begins to 1, everything else was 0, and then we have another dummy code called adapt end, where the adapt ends are 1s and everything else was 0s. And at this point, the no adapt is our reference category. It's 0s in all of these kind of new categorized variables that we have. All right, so that's kind of an overview. Let's jump into AMOS now, and I'll show you kind of what it looks like and the output and all those good things. So for the sake of time, I went ahead and coded everything in SPSS, and then now I've kind of brought in our new constructs, the adapt begin that's dummy coded and our adapt end that's dummy coded, both of those leading to delight and delight leading to positive word of mouth here. So if we run our analysis, the output that it's going to give us is going to kind of focus on the differences between kind of our dummy variables and our reference our variables. So let me explain what that means. So initially we get kind of our default screen, no problem there. So in our output here, you can see that adapt begin is let's scoot this over a little bit. Adapt begin has a 0.837 unstandardized regression weight. We're really not looking at standardized regression weights when it comes to dummy coding these variables. You really probably just need to stick to the unstandardized. So we have an unstandardized regression weight of 0.837 and the t-value was 10.934. So just as a recap, and I've got a full video that explains this in detail, but I'll just give you an overview of this too. When you're dummy coding variables, you have dichotomous categorical variables. That regression weight, or that unstandardized regression weight, is really just more the difference of means across the categories. So in this instance, it's the difference of delight across the multiple categories. And so from that adapt begin to customer delight, we can see that it has a positive relationship, and since adapt begin was coded as a 1, we know that that positive relationship there, the difference says that it's stronger to the positive than to the 0. If it was stronger to the 0, which was coded in our reference category, which was no adapt whatsoever, then you could say, well, the no adapt category was stronger than the begin, or adapting at the begin. But in this instance, since our regression coefficient is positive and we coded adapt begin as the 1, we can say, well, adapting the service at the beginning has a stronger effect than the no adapt group, and then that relationship specifically to delight. If we see the adapt in one right above it right here, you can see too that adapt in has a relationship to delight. So adapting the very end of the experience had an influence to delight. T-value was 14.94. And in regards to interpretation, again, this is that regression estimate there is in regards to the reference variable. So compared to the no adapt group, there was a substantial difference in the positive. That adapt in was stronger than the no adapt group. And if you're looking like relatively, across these two as well, again, a reference group was no adapt. And you can see, well, the adapt in had a bigger difference across the no adapt comparison compared to the adapt at the beginning, to the no adapt group. So you can say relatively, well, which one has kind of a relatively stronger effect? Well, the adapt in does, because the difference on that was bigger. And so when we're kind of interpreting those, again, your interpretation is really in regards to your reference variable. So we're saying, well, adapt end is stronger, but it's to the no adapt group, and adapt at the begin was stronger compared to the no adapt group. And then you can see the differences between adapt in and adapt in and adapt begin, and can see where the difference is, greater too, which one has a bigger effect. Again, those numbers could be completely different in the negative if I coded those as zeros instead of ones. And so that's just something you have to know when you're dummy coding too, when you're talking about positive and negative signs. Well, it really depends on how you code the data, really, too. So in this instance, adapt begin, I coded as a 1. And so when the results came out, it's going to be in the positive. So if we also look kind of a simple model fit too in here, we can see, we're going to get kind of these traditional kind of model fit estimates here, relative chi-square, CFI, TLI, root mean square. All these kind of look really good too. And we would just kind of write it up like we would do kind of a normal kind of structural relationship. Now, I know many of you at this point are saying too, but what if I want to statistically show if there is a difference between adapt, begin, and adapt in? Like I can see a difference there, but I want to know, like statistically. Well, what you could do is you could kind of go back and you would dummy code those again, just to have maybe a single independent construct, and then you would dummy code, let's say, just adapt begin as 1, and you would do adapt in as 0, and then you would kind of just ignore the reference one if you just want to simply look at just the difference between the begin and end from a statistical standpoint. So you can isolate that effect. Now, I did this with 3 categories. If you had 4 categories, it would be kind of the same thing. You would have, instead of 2, you would have 3 independents that you would need to have going to this. You'd still have a reference variable. So it doesn't matter the number of categories. It kind of works the exact same way. One thing you just need to remember is you've got to dummy code those into kind of 1s and 0s, and that one of your categories need to be a reference variable that it's used off of that. Pretty straightforward. It gets a little bit more complicated when you start talking about mediation and moderation on that, but just from a simple structural standpoint, it's pretty straightforward. If you're looking for more information on categorical variables, how to use those in more kind of complex ways with mediation, moderation, and just kind of general kind of SEM questions as well, I would encourage you to check out my book. It's at most major bookstores right now. There's a link in the description as well. And then if you saw value in this video, I'd ask that you like and subscribe. Because there's more videos to come. I hope you'll have a great week. Stay safe.